Good morning and welcome to the Central Bank of Kenya press briefing. This briefing is happening today, the 30th of September 2020, after yesterday's Monetary Policy Committee meeting and the press conference. The MPC yesterday released its press release, which came to all of you, and it's also published on the Central Bank of Kenya website and on all our social media platforms. This is the customary press conference that is there after that meeting. And as is the custom, we shall be hearing from the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Dr. Njoroge. He will run through his presentation, and after that, we shall take questions, if any. If you want to submit questions, you're a member of the press or the media, analyst, or anyone else, please send those questions through Slido, as we usually do. The meeting code is MPC09, MPC09. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and get in the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Dr. Njoroge, to make his submissions.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be with you again today on yet another of our post-MPC meeting briefing. And as Wallace has explained, we will go through the usual rundown of issues, questions that came up, and also towards the end take up some questions. But this time around, I've been informed that we will also have a few slides, and we will maybe to elaborate on one or two things. And so there will be a slight change in the usual choreography. Of course, we are at the hands of our very able IT colleagues. So yesterday, the MPC met and assessed the developments since the last meeting 2 months ago. And as you will recall, following the steep declines steep declines in the second quarter of 2020 across a wide swath of countries around the world, there are signs of a global recovery, but the outlook remains uncertain. Economies have emerged from lockdown, but the question is, will there be a second wave of infections? There has been the easing of containment measures around the world. But then again, what will happen in this quarter as people adopt new habits that have now been put in place? So there is a lot of uncertainty with regard to where the economies, the global economy will be. I think there's a slide we could show. Yes, this slide shows the number of confirmed COVID cases. This is weekly numbers, scaled by population. So this is by per 1,000 of population. And you can see, now it was just a selection of countries, but I think earlier in the year, the March, April, you can see the surge in Spain, UK, and the other countries. And then towards the end, you can see, or say June, you can see South Africa, and of course the other countries there. And now you can see that Spain is, there's an increase. In August, there was an increase in August, now it's coming down. But I think there is that concern about the second wave, which of infections in the major economies, UK, US, and of course, in this case, we are looking at Spain. Now, at the bottom there, you can see Kenya, sort of not quite at the same scale in the sense that the numbers are very small. But I think the point here is that, as was explained yesterday, in the day before yesterday, in the discussions that we had in the national COVID conference, that really we cannot take chances. We cannot be complacent. Rather, we need to continue taking the preventive measures. Let's move on with the rest of the preparation, of the presentation. While the export order, cut Wallace, while the export order and merchandise volumes have, while export orders, I should have said, and merchandise volumes, that's trade, have recovered strongly. And also the PMIs, the purchasing manager, PMIs, purchasing managers data, have also improved. They are north of 50 as in many of the countries. And then, of course, the travel restrictions have been lifted after, of course, international tourist arrivals plunged, and this is across the world, plunged something like more than 90%. So there was a complete cessation, almost complete cessation of international travel earlier in the year, that is in April, May, and through June. Remittances have also rebounded strongly or recovered strongly. So these are remittance outflows from particularly the advanced economies, and they've recovered strongly since May. So that's the general sense of where the global economy is, or the trends on the global economy, at least relative to where we were 2 months ago. What about the domestic economy? The domestic economy, we could probably say that we are in a transition towards post-COVID. So those words, we choose them carefully. Transition towards post-COVID. Clearly, we are not in the post-COVID era. We are still struggling with COVID. But at the same time, there are some elements of that are positive that we need to bring forward, hence the term transition. And of course, in the post-COVID environment, there will be specific things that we need to deal with, and we'll come back to some of those issues. Inflation remains subdued, and today we are expecting inflation numbers for this month, but we expect that to remain subdued as it has been over the last few months. Food is plentiful, despite all the earlier shocks. Now you have to go way back to when we had the locusts, when we had the floods, but we have had, this year we've had good rains, and we've also had the sun, good sun, which is important for growth of crops, etc. And the crop production remains high. For instance, with regard to maize, maize is an important commodity, as we all know. We are expecting, having had conversations with the Minister of Agriculture and the others that are very close to the farmers, we are expecting something like 42.7 million bags, that's production. And that compares to 39.8 million bags in 2019. So it's an increase, but I think also this is somewhat, it may actually overshoot this number for several reasons, but I think this is the number that at this moment looks likely. Other items like beans, also beans, we are expecting sort of a steady, production of 8.1 million bags, and compared to 8.3 in 2019. Other commodities, potatoes. Potatoes, we are expecting 2.4 million bags compared to 2 million bags last year. And other commodities. Basically, we are benefiting from the rather favorable weather conditions. Tea production has continued to record very strong growth and is projected to perform very well for the remainder of the year. We are expecting production of 29.4 thousand metric tons, which compares to, we are expecting 594,000 metric tons, which compares to 459,000 metric tons in 2019, a growth of 29.4%. So volume growth of 29.4%, which obviously will be reflected in the volume of exports in the year. So that is obviously very good news, again, benefiting from the good weather and the favorable weather conditions. So for we can also talk about cane production. We have a lot of data, and I think we all understand that the MPC has to digest a lot of detailed data, but I think I just want to highlight some of these things. Cane deliveries, for instance, another important product. So total cane delivery is expected to be in the order of 5,917 as compared to 4,606 thousand tons. That is production, an increase of 28.5%. So this is cane production. Milk. I would actually ask, what type of milk do you want? Cows, camel, sheep, goat? Anyway, putting it all together, production of milk is projected to be 5,828 million liters, which compares to 5,342 million liters in 2019. So there is a significant increase, about 9%. So you can see in agriculture there is actually some dynamism. Basically, agriculture wasn't affected much by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we expect it to grow reasonably well. And we have estimated currently a number like 5.8% growth, so around 6%. Now we are refining it, but I think the point here is that agriculture will be a strong engine or a strong driver of the dynamism in the economy. Mining and quarrying, this is important, but I think the point here is looking at the production, let's say, of cement, cement consumption. That has grown relatively well, and actually it has been sustained quite well. It's only in July that there was actually a dip in growth, year-on-year growth of 3.8%. But in June, there was an increase of 8.9 and so forth, right through the year, from January through June. So only the July dip. Basically, cement consumption continues, or cement production and consumption signals that, or indicates a strong growth in the mining and quarrying sector, but also is a good indicator of the building and construction sector. So that is something that obviously we've looked at. There's also been significant improvement in the exports and indeed production of titanium. So on the whole, mining and quarrying, we expect it to grow by about 9.6% in 2020. The manufacturing sector, we have looked at various indicators, credit growth to manufacturing sector. And this is something that continues. There's a continued credit uptick. So year on year, for instance, from January through August, the minimum growth has been 10%. So actually, that was in February. In August, it was 14%. In July, it was 11%. So there has been continued growth of this of credit to the manufacturing sector. There has also been strong growth in the turnover in the manufacturing sector. And that is after the dip. There was a significant dip in April and May, but that has since recovered. And in August, there was a growth of 5.9%. So there is recovery in the sector. Of course, we also look at the intermediate, the imports of intermediate goods, which obviously are an input in for manufacturing and other sectors as well, but definitely for manufacturing, and that has actually recovered. We've also looked at electricity consumption and also PMI. I'm just giving you a sense of the leading indicators or the indicators of performance in those sectors. And having put this together, manufacturing, we expect it to grow during the year, that's in 2020, by about 2.6%. So it's not a collapse. On the contrary, after a sort of a stagnation in those periods where there was the lockdown and or cessation of travel, etc., we see a recovery, and for the year, something like 2.6%. Wholesale and trade, this is wholesale and retail trade, sorry. Credit also has remained strong, and the sales turnover yes, so credit to the sector, that's the wholesale and retail trade sector, has actually grown year on year. The lowest growth was in August, which was 4.2%. And in terms of the sales turnover, again, after a dip in April and May, so there was that dip in April and May, and then a sort of a gradual recovery June, July. So in April, the sales turnover fell by 16%, and then in May by 20%, and in June it fell by 3.6, and in July by 4.2. Actually, in August, it's showing the first sign since April of positive growth, so a recovery, albeit small, of 0.3. So recovery, hopefully that will be sustained in light of the reopening of or the removal of those travel restrictions. So we are expecting that this will grow by about 2.5%, looking at other indicators as well. But why is the softness in the economy? At this moment, of course, it is in accommodation and restaurants. And I think this is not a surprise to anybody. Reason being, there was actually that, let's say, restriction on the operation of restaurants, and obviously in some hotels they even closed their operations, and in light of the reduction in, or let's say, the cessation of international travel. So yes, this is a soft spot, and the recovery of that will be contingent on a full recovery of international travel or international arrivals, and of course other things, the lifting of the restrictions, as we had 2 days ago, that now actually those restaurants can open and much later, meaning they have to close by 10 p.m. As opposed to the restrictions that were there, closing much earlier. So that is a sector that is really the soft spot, and we expect it to contract for the year by something like 40%. But again, we'll talk a bit more about what is happening in the hotel sector later on in my presentation. The ICT sector is also one that I would want to flag. The ICT sector has been sort of one of the sectors, that backbone, let's say, of how we have operated during this period of the COVID-19 period. And as we all understand, we had recourse to more ICT services, particularly data services and things like that. So we expect that sector to do very well for the year, and we have conservatively estimated it at 12.8%, but this is actually a very conservative estimate, bearing in mind what is happening in the sector. Now, we don't have some of the numbers, but we will finalize the numbers as we get this. But that is definitely one of the bright spots in our economy. There is a sector I want to mention something about, and this is the education sector. The education sector has been okay, there we go. The education sector, we all understand what happened. There was schools were closed, people went home, the students, the learners went home, and in as much as they can, they were trying to move some of those lessons online. But obviously, one can expect that that wasn't as complete as, let's say, in other sectors, in other economies where maybe ICT technologies are much more internet, for instance, availability and so forth are much higher than, or is much higher than here in Kenya. But the point, of course, is that during that period, nevertheless, in terms of the public institutions, they continue to be paid fully by the government. It is true there has been some private sector, some private schools that did not pay their teachers. They couldn't make payroll, as it were. But I think the point there is that issue of the treatment of workers in the education sector who are not going to the classroom, but yet, that is teachers, for instance, or lecturers, but yet they are being paid fully. Their payroll or their pay is every month they are getting their pay as before. Now, we have had some discussions and so forth, and I want to tell you that this is a matter that we have looked at, how to estimate the production, or should we say the contribution of that sector, and we have used guidance by other, let's say, standard setters. And anyway, so the point here is that we have not fully incorporated, we have not assumed that production in that sector is zero, right? And in any event, this is something that is more technical than anything else. But I want to flag this as something that maybe some of us will be surprised that production, as indicated in that sector, did not go down to zero. But anyway, the point is that it was caught up, and actually teachers did consume as before, and we have therefore continued to indicate that, at least a portion of that, as production in the sector. That is all I want to say about the specific sectors. But in terms of the overall outcome, we are projecting something growth for the year, something in the order of 3.1% in 2020. But obviously this has wide error band. So it is not a precise, meaning a point estimate. And it could very well be higher depending on how maybe the caveats that I raised, for instance, in ICT, also in agriculture, etc. Manufacturing also could be higher. But also it could be lower depending on what happens going forward. We don't know how this disease will evolve, and I think the responsibility of our policymakers, and indeed our government in this case, is to make sure that there isn't another wave of infections, and therefore will continue to maybe adjust the restrictions as has happened in other economies. That is as much as I want to say about the domestic economy in terms of the specific sectors, and I do understand that I have yeah, I've gone a bit in a lot more detail than we are generally used to. But that said, there are two other things that I would want to mention. We did have, one of the key concerns, as I said, was the accommodation, the hotel sector. And this month, we did a specific survey on September 20th to 23rd. And we asked them various questions, but I think it indicates a certain recovery. And you can see the slide that is before you. Obviously, in January and June, this is only one, let's say, slide or one answer that we are presenting from the responses of the survey. And this concerns the operations, meaning how many hotels, were the hotels open? And you can see in January, February, all hotels that we sampled or that responded were open, right? But then in the March, April, May, that actually came down dramatically. And the Nairobi and environs, at least the hotels that we talked to, 43% of them were open. And you can also understand that some of these hotels were used as quarantine, for holding in quarantine those travelers that had arrived, etc. So there was a lot of other, let's say, operations aside from the standard tourist sort of operations that were there. Now, what is interesting is that you can see there is a recovery. So you can already see in August, it went up to 80%, 82% in the case of the rest of the country, or the respondents from the rest of the country, and 86% in the case of Nairobi and environs. And I think this is good news. Of course, we do understand that in August, that's when there was a return of the flights, international flights, or a reopening of international travel. And I think aside from that, there has also been a lot of local, most of the, as the survey showed, most of the, more than 90%, actually 99% of those, let's say, of the guests in the hotels were local. And that, I think, was very interesting. Now, there's also some more information about forward bookings, that is also in the survey. But I'll let you look at the survey in detail. It will be released along with the market perception survey, I guess, in the next couple of days. Another thing I wanted to mention is the MPC market perception survey. We can go to the next slide. And there are many questions, the standard questions that are raised, but I only wanted to focus on one of them, which is the level of optimism. Now, you have banks and non-banks. In terms of banks, you can see that January, well, the 92% of the banks were very optimistic, or optimistic. So level of optimism of 92%. And that obviously plummeted, and they bottomed out in May at 44%. But you can see there is a strong recovery to 81%. In the case of non-banks, that's the same thing that we are seeing there. You have 72% of respondents were very optimistic or optimistic. So the level of optimism was 72%. And that plummeted to 30% in May, and then has recovered to 62%. That is the 59 plus the 3. So you can see that the optimism in the economy is coming back, or people are a lot more optimistic. This obviously, particularly in the September return, which was done this month, this follows the opening up or return of international travel, and the reduction in restrictions, reduction, obviously restrictions including reduction of curfew hours, etc. So I want to move now to the balance of payments. And again, this I'll try and do a bit quickly. So the balance of payments, exports have rebounded quite well, particularly horticultures after the decline in April. And this reflects the normalization of demand in the countries, the destination countries, and also adequate cargo space. I think we talked about that last time, but I think now with the return of international travel, cargo space is quite adequate. So this exports grew by 0.8% overall, but I think what you are seeing on the slide there is some specific exports, and this is only for January to August. So the blue is obviously 2019, and the gold is 2020. So you can see tea exports already for those 8 months has grown from 726 to 850. Horticultures obviously is a decline for the period, but in the recent period that has actually recovered quite strongly, and we talked about it in the press release. I will not quote that, but it is in the press release. I think the point here is that you can see, for the most part, many of the exports are recovering. The one that I think we would want to flag is, of course, the flower exports. And the next slide shows that. Yes, that's the slide. And you can see, for instance, that the gold, the real dip was in April, right? March and April, of course, May. And then it recovered in May, June, and has continued to recover. By the way, the blue in June, the very unusual 15,000 metric tons, that relates to substantial, let's say, overperformance by Kenyan exports of flowers, which related to, let's say, a shortage, let's put it that way, or inability to deliver by some of our competitors. So in effect, our competitors could not deliver, and therefore we pretty much moved in and increased our production to that amount. But you can see now it has recovered quite well. And for the 27 days to September, up to September 27th, you can already see that we have exported 11,477 metric tons compared to 8,000 in the previous year. That is the year of September, the year of 2019. So I think the point here is to just indicate that the recovery on the export side has gone quite well, and we are overcoming, or we have overcome the dip that was there in early on in March, April, May. One other point I would want to mention is remittances, and remittances, as was mentioned in the statement, have recovered quite well. As I said earlier, remittances have recovered in the source countries, meaning the outflows. You remember that there were predictions, or dire predictions, that remittances would collapse. And this is a real concern, because it's a lifeline for a lot of our economies and a lot of our people. And but I think we have seen that it has actually been quite resilient. And for August, there was inflows of 274,000 or million US dollars into Kenya. Now, I need to add something, which is there is a curious dip in remittances in July and August. from the peak of 288 million US dollars in June. But I want to emphasize that if you look at the flows, the monthly flows in 2019, 18, 17, and 16, you will actually see that dip. So seasonal factors dominate and push, or rather, we generally get lower inflows during that period. Now, I think maybe with the new opening of schools, universities, and all that, there'll be sort of a change here. But I think the point here is that in the months of July, August, and September, we've generally seen a gradual decline. And then, I mean, from the peak in June, and then there's a recovery in the last quarter of the year. So that is actually following that seasonal pattern. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the current account through August is, or we estimated a current account deficit of 4.7% of GDP. This compares to 5.1% of GDP in 2019. And for the year, as you can see on the slide, we expect this to be, the year 2020, we expect the current account deficit to be in the order of 5.1%. Now, that is a long series of the evolution of the current account. And you can see there has been a substantial contraction, almost halved the current account deficit in terms of GDP, right? From 11.2 in 2011, and 2014 was 10.4, and then a continued reduction to around 5%. We've already mentioned this before, that our estimate of where we should be in the long term is around 5%. So a current account deficit of 5%, we believe, is what our economy can bear or is appropriate for our economy. So thank you for that. I'll come back to issues of exchange rate in a minute. So what are the things that remain? I think the point, one of the issues that, one of the points that we as MPC members looked at was the economic stimulus package that the government has put in place and is implementing. And we assessed that has not played out in its entirety, and meaning it is actually being put in place gradually, and therefore will continue to provide a stimulus, stimulus to the economy, and therefore we do need to, the MPC judge that it is important to wait and see the benefits of this stimulus package. Now, at the same time, the MPC members did also note that a new credit guarantee scheme that we have been talking about for some time, that is to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, was about to be launched or will be launched shortly. This was emphasized also by His Excellency the President in his speech 2 days ago at the end of the National COVID Conference, as I mentioned earlier. So that is something that will also provide some, let's say, a safety net for the MSMEs as we as we transition to the post-COVID period. One other point that needs to be mentioned is it is evident that the government, in implementing its program, did borrow both domestically and externally. And that obviously has implications in terms of debt levels. And as you know, this has been circulated before, but the June numbers, so the most recent data that we have is end June, and that had increased to 64.6% of GDP. So debt as a share of GDP, both external and domestic. And this is obviously public and publicly guaranteed debt. That had increased to 65.6% of GDP. And the point here, though, is that, yes, it was appropriate to provide financing for the needed expenditures, but it is therefore more urgent and appropriate to anchor a recovery to the more normal, let's say, debt levels in the medium term. So that issue is important. So we cannot just look at the current levels and determine that, well, every country increases debt levels. It had to happen. Virtually every single country had to borrow in order to deal with those urgent COVID issues, as we all understand it. It was an existential problem, frankly, not just of the economies, but of ourselves as human beings. So I think it's important to note it that way. We should also appreciate that there's no such thing as a sort of a sharp threshold. Unfortunately, some of the discussions that are there make it clear, or rather assume, that there's a sort of a determined or deterministic line, such that if you cross that line, then you get into significant problems and all that. And I think that is not correct. There is a sense of, there's a gray zone, as it were. And frankly, we need to understand that, yes, we are in the gray zone, and we need to go back into areas that provide us more elbow room, as it were, in terms of being pushed by various shocks, including the shock that we now are fighting with or are recovering from, the COVID-19 shock. So, bottom line, it is important to anchor the debt profile in the long term on correctly, and should we say credibly, so that the economy and indeed the population can be assured that we are going back into more normal territory after being buffeted and tossed back and forth by these significant shocks. I want to say a few things about the banking sector, though I know I have overdone it here, but I think we have to say something about the banking sector. Where is it? Okay. Just a second, let's get that together. Yes. So in terms of the banking sector, I think the point to make here is that the sector remains stable and resilient. And at the end of August, as was mentioned in the press, in the communique, the capital adequacy ratio was 18.4, and which is above the statutory minimum. And liquidity ratio was high at 53.25. Above the statutory minimum of 20%. Now, gross loans as a share of, gross non-performing loans as a share of gross loans, so the NPL ratio, as we call it in shorthand, increased from 13.1% in June to 13.6% in August. And in terms of the specific areas where the increases, the sectors where the increases were recorded or registered, real estate was one of these, with about 4.7 billion. And this, I think we can understand, due to the low occupancy of housing and other commercial interests, commercial units, and of course the rent defaults that we have seen. Personal and household loans, about 3.7 as well. 3.7 due to job loss and other things, pay cuts, etc. Transportation and communication, 3.6 billion, and of building and construction, 3.4 billion. So those are the large sectors. But I think the point here is that the increase is to be understood that against the backdrop of a significant shock. Now, we have to underscore that the performing loans, the loans that were performing as of March 2nd, have not been classified in this way, right? So those have been performing, and that was the, so a lot of this relates to the earlier ones, meaning pre-March 2nd, loans that were already, let's say, on the watch list during that period. So I think the point here is that the sector has remained resilient. It has done, as we mentioned in the press, in the communique, there has been a lot of restructuring of loans, and in a sense have provided that breathing space for a lot of our establishments. And they have been given space for recovery, and thereby can provide or can make good their payments, in line with the new timelines that they have agreed with the banks. This has been done on a case-by-case basis. I want to insist to underscore that it has not been a sort of across-the-board adjustment. So banks have had to have that conversation with the borrower. After all, they had a conversation with the borrower when the borrower borrowed. So I think the point here is it is not unusual. They've just explained the circumstances and understood and come to agreements on how those payments will be made going forward. So I want to make two other points on, or one other point on the COVID, on the about banks, and then leave it there. Just to clarify what actually we expect of banks. I think the first thing going forward, I think the first thing here is that the banks have been working internally, and they will, as we requested, they will be presenting to us what we call the internal capital adequacy assessment process documents. So ICAPS documents, or ICAP documents. And this is not a surprise. As a matter of fact, they do this every year. The only thing is, and they presented it to us earlier in the year, only that now we want them to actually incorporate the understandings of the evolution of the economy in the context of COVID-19. And on that basis, having redone their ICAPs and having discussed it internally, including at the boards or by the boards, then they will discuss it with us, and then on that basis, they will decide on how exactly the various decisions that they need to make. Of course, one of the decisions is about dividends and things like that, but that's not the only decision, as you can all imagine. I mean, there are many other decisions that need to be made in that context. And I think this is not a surprise that the regulator is working, in a sense, with the banks to come up with something that is appropriate for the banks, and also, in a sense, thereby appropriate for the overall economy. I want to move on quickly now to some of the final things. There has been some conversations about the exchange rate, and but before we deal with the exchange rate, there were what are erroneous statements in some of the newspapers, the pink newspaper. And there's also some other one in its sister newspaper. I'm not going to go into that, but they're here somewhere. And I think the point I want to make is I want to make the point that that was erroneous. And it's unfortunate that statements like that can be made so without due regard. The bottom line is that, yes, Kenya is negotiating with the United States. And this is, as we all know, this has been discussed widely. And there are specific indications or specific areas, 27 areas. 27 areas that you could say the United States has indicated as objectives. That document of the objectives was actually circulated by the United States, made public quite some time ago. And I have it here. And it is public, right? And in there, if you go to the last point, one of the areas, and I'm going to read it, quote, currency. Ensure that Kenya avoids manipulating exchange rates in order to prevent effective balance of payments adjustment, all to gain an unfair competitive advantage, end quote. So that is one of the objectives. And there are 26 other objectives in this document. So that is the negotiation positions of obviously the United States, which are public. The point is that the United States has, let's say, a template of objectives, and they are well put together in that document. And I think the point here is that that is how the United States is actually dealing with all the negotiations that it has been working with. It doesn't mean that Kenya is a currency manipulator. Mind you, there are 26 other points there. So this is not proof or a statement that Kenya is a currency manipulator. And we actually, the aspersions that are cast by that sort of article or careless article is what I think we are sort of referring to here. So, in February 2019, another document of the United States, it's here. And this relates to its negotiations, exactly like Kenya, negotiations with the United Kingdom. And I go again to the end. There's a paragraph which is currency, and I quote, ensure that the UK avoids manipulating exchange rates in order to prevent effective balance of payments adjustment or to gain an unfair competitive advantage, end quote. So that's their position with the UK. Exactly the same. The only difference in these two things is really the names of the country. Another one. This is the objectives with regard to NAFTA. This is the post-NAFTA, or rather NAFTA renegotiations. NAFTA is the US, Canada, and of course Mexico. And again, now here, of course, the United States is part of NAFTA, so the wording is a little different, but communicates the same objective. And I quote, through an appropriate mechanism, ensure that the NAFTA countries, which includes the US, avoid manipulating exchange rates in order to prevent effective balance of payments adjustments, all to gain an unfair competitive advantage. I think the point here is that the article that was, and the articles that have followed since then, have been erroneous and have in effect misguided all the readers in terms of where we stand on the exchange rate and our specific. We've again repeated our policy again and again. And our policy is simply that we have a flexible exchange rate regime that has served us well. and we intervene to minimize volatility. That is the only thing we do. We don't target a rate, we don't target a direction. We allow the market to determine a well-behaved market to determine the outcome in terms of direction and rate. Of course, we make sure that there's a lot of, that the actors in the market follow the rules so that we don't have predatory behavior in the market here. And I think we've seen that in some markets. I'm talking of other jurisdictions where actually even banks have ended up misbehaving and thereby for their own good, meaning their own financial gain. So that is a thing that we are concerned about, but I think in terms of the policy it is there. So I think it is for the people that actually are responsible for this pink paper and its sister to figure out what to do. Obviously, watacheza kama hao. But I think the point is it's difficult for us, except, and I think we have the same difficulty as anybody playing against Manchester United, because you may end up leaving the field and then being called back for penalties after the full time. So I think we want to leave it there. In terms of the exchange rate itself, could you please show the final slides? So this is the performance of the exchange rate. And this is to Friday last week. And you can see, so this is the appreciation or depreciation against the US dollar of a selection of countries. And you can see Kenya shilling is somewhere in the middle there, right? Close between euro and the Norwegian or Norway krona. No, I guess it's Norwegian krona. 7% depreciation, and you can see the variety of other countries there. But I think this also has to be judged, this movement has to be judged also in the long term, because we are not, and I think the next slide shows the movement of our currency, of these currencies from January, through 2019. And Kenya appreciated by about 0.5%. Which is modest. I think that is modest, well, small appreciation. Again, middle of the pack. 2018, again, Kenya shilling around 1.3%, middle of the pack. So you can see that any concerns about movement and things like that, I think they are misplaced. But I think the point here is that we have indicated what our exchange rate policy is, and we will maintain that because it has served us well. I want to stop there and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Dr. Patrick Njoroge, going through his presentation. Today's has been quite detailed because we do have slide presentation or slides that he presented. We'll make sure all these are available, so if you keep an eye on our website and on our social media channels, we'll make sure that the entire set of slides is available to you and you can be able to see them. You can use them as well, but as usual, if you do use them, ensure that you quote the Central Bank of Kenya as the source. Now, as we usually do, we have a bunch of questions that have come through. And just as a reminder, in case you're going to send any more questions, it's through Slido. The hashtag is #MPC09. We'll begin with the first batch, just 4 questions. The first one is from Razia Khan, is Africa and Middle East Chief Economist for Standard Chartered. She asks, in the CBK's view, what are the likely drivers of medium-term growth in Kenya? Razia Khan has a second question. Just a reminder, Africa Middle East Chief Economist for Standard Chartered. Second question is, how does the CBK currently view monetary policy accommodation? What factors might prompt the CBK to ease further or perhaps tighten further? Third question from Gerald Yekara of Uzalendo News. The pandemic has caused financial distress to emerging markets. Would you say that Kenya has triumphed as a resilient economy in comparison to our neighbors? The final one in this batch is from Elizabeth Kivuva from the Business Daily. There has been a reduction in Forex by 200 million US dollars. Was this bought by Treasury to pay an external loan? Those are the questions for this batch, and we'll come back to more questions once the governor takes those ones.
Thank you very much, Wallace. So on the first batch, drivers of medium-term growth in Kenya. I think the first thing to appreciate is that Kenya is highly diversified. So I think that is something that we have benefited from. So that has always, we've mentioned this as a source of our resilience. And so we want to maintain a highly diversified economy. That is one thing that we need to be. At the same time, in terms of drivers, we need to go back to some of our, let's say, our strengths. And the first of this is things related to our population. Our population, well-educated, youth, etc., highly IT savvy and things like that. That, I think, is a significant, or should be a significant driver for medium-term growth. So what that means, your guess, my guess, we can predict. But I think the point here is that you do have what I would call, a significant sort of powder keg that can explode if given, if we actually give the right conditions to it. So youthful population, highly innovative, and IT. That is, and obviously educated, English as a language that they fully understand. So you can see developments, say, in the ICT area. You can also see significant developments in the financial sector area. And also maybe other things like manufacturing, etc. Secondly, we happen to be very well located. So geography is also on our side. So particularly when we begin thinking about the expansion of the free trade area, the African continent, the continental free trade area. So from that perspective, you can imagine that with benefit of geography, there will be a lot of interest in setting up, let's say, production lines, whatever else it is, manufacturing, here in Kenya, so as to serve, let's say, the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. That is something that I think will work in our favor going forward. I think the final things, this is hardly, I don't want to call it a driver of medium-term growth, but I think it is what you may call the atmosphere. So in terms of, let's say, ease of doing business and things like that, that will always be something that will make or attract investments. And I mean not only foreign investment, but also domestic investment. And so appropriate rules and appropriate legal frameworks and all that, I think that is something that will continue to benefit from. Of course, there'll be all those other surprises, but I think the point here is we do not see ourselves as, say, South Africa or Tanzania or other sectors where you can, other areas, Angola, for instance, where you can say there's a specific, let's say, in this case, mineral that, that can be helpful in terms of pushing up the envelope of production of the economy. So then the second question, I hope that answers the question, but in the second question is about the view about monetary policy accommodation. And I think the point here is that we are still in a very accommodative sort of space. And, but I think the point is there is a lot of liquidity in the system as well. So it is important to understand how that accommodative policy is playing out in the economy. And I think that is why, one of the reasons why MPC members or the MPC did not adjust the rates. But I think more importantly, the objective is to maintain the economy or stimulate the economy. And the MPC members, in this case, or yesterday, determined that it was better to allow to wait and see the fiscal measures that are part of the economic stimulus program make their way through in the system, through the economy. So I think the point here is that this is the stance that we will hold for the foreseeable future until the data reveals that it is time to change. And the data would be, for instance, a significant, let's say, excess liquidity. At this moment, the MPC determined that the liquidity level, even though high, was appropriate. By the way, it is quite evenly spread. So there isn't sort of pockets of, let's say, tightness, significant tightness in the economy. So the point here is that we believe that we'll hold on this policy, and when there is new data, we will act accordingly. I cannot tell you when that will be, but I think the point here is that we will remain open to all tools. That's why there was that line at the end of the communique that says something along the lines that the MPC will continue to monitor, or the central bank will continue to monitor developments in the economy. And then the question about pandemic has caused financial distress to emerging markets, and would I say Kenya triumphed as a resilient economy in comparison to our neighbors? I think I wouldn't say that. I don't think so. The point is that if you look at, I mean, and this is a standard issue, right? I mean, a standard question. When we were in school, we were told, don't compare yourself with the others. Meaning, if you say that you are doing well because you're getting a better grade and so on your left, I'm sure you look at the person on your right, and that person will have a better grade than you. So I think the point here is, the question to ask is, have we done what we should have done? And is there more that we could have done? And I think the answer here is that we are very conscious of the risks, in particular the financial sector risks, risk to stability of the financial sector. And also, for that matter, the other side, which is maintaining an over-tightness because of fear of inflation or other factors. And I think the point here is that we have tried to walk that sort of middle path and to chart a middle course that balances the risks of significant or risks of, let's say, financial instability, or for that matter, a resurgence of inflation, and also the risks in terms of having a very tight sort of environment, which obviously doesn't do justice to the recovery. This is Elizabeth. There has been a reduction in Forex by 200 million. Was this bought by Treasury to pay an external loan? All I can say is that we make payments. Our Forex, let's say the level of our foreign exchange reserves is used, or rather our foreign exchange reserves, we use them for payments, including payments for the government. After all, they have to make external payments, and there are some loans, as you know, that they have, and that is public. It's actually in the they put it out in the budget statements and things like that. So we are making those payments to them, not only this month, but every single month, and for that matter, every single week. Wallace.
All right. Thank you, Governor. Looking at the second batch of questions, there's only 2 more batches of questions, fairly simple. The first question in this batch is from Victoria Amunga from MTV. I'm not sure it's MTV, the music channel, or NTV, one that is familiar to all of us. But in any event, Victoria asks, what in your perspective was the greatest impact of COVID-19 to the banking sector? To what extent, and your recovery plan to this effect? The second question is from David Herbling of Bloomberg News. Are you concerned about the output gap in the Kenyan economy? What do you think needs to be done to rev up output and growth? The third question is from Kefa Moirore of Radio Citizen. He asks, what new directives should we expect to see from the CBK as some of the cushioning measures end, i.e. CRB listings moratorium and loan restructuring in brackets March 2021? Last question in this batch from David Herbling. He asks, is CBK probing the Kenyan banks named in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, better known as FinCEN, suspicious activity reports?
Okay, fine. So thank you very much, Wallace, and thank you, the questioners. So Vicky asks about the perspective of the greatest impact on the banking sector. I think there are two general things. First, we have to appreciate what the banking sector has done. And it has done wonders. And you can imagine this is after a few years ago, bankers and the banking sector were the pariah sector, meaning there was some serious, let's say, the perspective of the population was that these are the gangsters, right? In terms of misunderstanding what is going on, in terms of the problems that of the common borrowers, common wananchi, and things like that. Now, that is completely diametrically opposed to what has happened in the COVID-19 period, where the bankers actually were the first to reach out to you, the borrower, and ask you to come in and have that conversation with them. And there has been a lot of restructuring, as we mentioned, in terms of numbers. So I think that is significant. We would be talking a completely different language if bankers had the same attitude that they had, let's say, 2-3 years ago. And I think this is something that needs to be written up and not just explained, but appreciated. Because banks have gone significantly on a limb to support the economy. And it wasn't just by contributions and things like that. No. That's not really what it is. And that's not what it should be. It should be through their links with their borrowers. And that is every single person, Wanjiku and others, all out there. That has been significant in terms of the speed, in terms of the quantum, and in terms, let's say, of the considerations that were put in that. And I think this is something that you should write about. Now, at the same time, it has to be clear that it wasn't a free lunch. The banks have taken a hit. And I have seen some of the articles that some of you have written about the impact, let's say, on the financials in terms of the profitability and things like that. The ROEs, the return on equity or return on investment, but we look more at the return on equity, that has come down quite a bit of each of the banks. So I think the point here is that it wasn't a free lunch, but it has reflected a change in attitude of the banks, where they are working with the customer. Remember we talked about the banking sector charter, where actually they should be much more customer-centric and work with the customer. So I think this is really what we are saying, and that deserves obviously significant appreciation and praise. David asked the question, am I concerned about the output gap in the Kenyan economy? I think the point here is that we are miles away from considerations of output gap. Output gap, dear David, relates to things that sort of demand management, and relate to things that, let's say, are in the normal course of, let's say, business cycle. So they are along the business cycle. we are miles away from business cycle. So the point now, it is more, there has been significant breaks in the output and indeed the production process of economies. So we are not talking output gap. So to ask the question, well, what is the impact? And when you think about the output gap, you're generally thinking about how that will relate to, let's say, inflation, and then what policy do you have in order to tweak it? And in an old-fashioned way, you could think of sort of the Taylor function and all that, but anyway, let's leave that for now. So I think the point I'm making is that this is not, today we are not talking, and during this COVID period, we are not talking output gap. We already know that production, just think of not even output gap, think of, for instance, the production of, in our horticultural sector, right? Of course, you know that there are gaps there, but it's not output gap and therefore demand management that will solve the problem. Actually, what will solve the problem and what solved the problem in this case was availability of cargo space, availability of the markets. That was the breakage in it. So the point is that there was this sort of supply chain that was broken, and no amount of tweaking along the Taylor rule and others of policies, demand-side management policies will lead to a sort of a fixing of the supply chain. What needed to be done is dealing with that directly. So I hope I've answered your question. Kefa asks, what new direction should we expect to see from the CBK? I don't know. We've already talked about what we intend to do. So any other direction at this moment, no. But we are always open to seeing how things will play out. We are never in a sort of we never say never. Okay. So I hope that is clear to you. But in terms of the ending, the measures that are ending, that I think is clear. So from October 1, the banks will begin after the end of that period that we had said. They will then begin looking at the banks, at the borrowers, and assessing how they are doing in terms of their payments against their loans. And there is a process there. They will indicate, if let's say you haven't paid your loans, you have 60 days, they'll indicate that to you formally. I mean, so we are back again in the sort of rules, and then they'll give you 30 days. So you have 3 months to deal with, to regularize whatever you're not paying. But I think the point here is to just emphasize that, yes, we are going back to the normal operations, the way things used to happen, and that's where we will be come October 1.
Okay, so the last batch of questions, and it turns out actually that MTV, I'm informed reliably, is nothing to do with music, so no dancing. It's actually Metropole TV, Victoria Munga. A quick one, Brian Gugi, I believe your question has been answered. You are seeking comment with regard to the headline that you had in the Business Daily, and that's been answered. The third batch of questions, Domenico Mondi, I do realize that this question is the one that the governor has just spoken about. The question was, it's a month to the end of the 6 months since restructuring started. I believe this you mean of loans. Is CBK going to have a new round of talks with banks to reschedule some of these loans again? So the governor has already spoken about that, but is free to make additional comment. Kefa Mairori again, 1 year on since the rate repeal, or nearly a year on, what are some of the lessons we can draw from changes, and in specific, what has been the uptake of products such as Stawi? I believe Kefa Mairori is speaking about the rate cap repeal that happened in November of last year. Brenda Kerubo from KTN News, she asks, are you worried about consumer spending and potential for deflation? Otiato Guguyu from the Business Daily, the liquidity support jumped from 37 billion shillings, from 7.7 billion shillings, and 5 banks had taken 24.2 billion shillings in deposits from CBK. Is there systemic weakness or skewed liquidity? Finally, from Be The Mwema from Metropole TV, which turns out is MTV, she asks, a third of African countries are at risk of debt distress. Kenya's parliament says 49% of national revenues will fund debts. Is Kenya at risk of debt distress? That is the last of the questions.
Okay, thank you. I'll begin with Kefa's question. I think there are a lot of lessons, and this I think I would leave to you to look at it. I think the first one from my perspective at least is that we made the point that banks will transition into an environment that doesn't have rates caps or caps. And to the extent that we are working with them, we can actually manage it. And we made the point that deep water is not synonymous to drowning. I think I made that point before. I've given that, that picture or that phrase before. And I think, Kefa, you can see today and now, deep water that is not synonymous to drowning. You can teach somebody to swim and will love the deep water. And I think this has been something that, so the operation of the market, when it works correctly, it will benefit the consumers. It will benefit the depositors, it will benefit the borrowers. So I think that is in my view, the most significant lesson in all this. Now, there has been other things, of course. There are benefits, for instance, when banks are more customer-centric. There are benefits in the long term, but those, I think, are sort of second-order benefits which we can discuss. Now, in terms of specific products, I think, again, we are caught up in this COVID period. So it's very difficult to disentangle the impact of COVID, which has brought everything to a halt. I mean, you can imagine, why would you borrow? I mean, if you're just going to borrow and sit on the money, if actually there's no potential for expanding your business. So I think you should appreciate that there has been, let's say, factors more that have, let's say, dominated and consequently led to an outcome in terms of maybe less borrowing, etc. But we presume that as the economy reopens, those factors will be less relevant, and indeed we'll see the dynamism returning or continuing, as we've explained earlier. Brenda asks, am I worried about consumer spending and a potential deflation? At this moment, no. The consumer spending will come in. As I said, it's interesting to see, for instance, even in the hotel industry, a lot of Kenyans, as I said, 99% of the residents in the hotels since the reopening have been locals. And indeed, it's true, we did put on hold, as a population, we did put on hold a lot of our decisions because we didn't know. There was a lot of uncertainty as to how this was going to play out. But as that uncertainty sort of abates, there will be, I mean, we can expect that consumers will move to what they intend to do, which is this consumer, I mean, spending, etc., investment, and doing what they do best. I'll skip on the Otiato's question. And on Mwema's question, it is true a lot of countries, not just African countries, have increased their debt levels in the context of COVID-19, their response to COVID-19. That is something that, as I explained earlier, is appropriate. Now, how much you increase it by, etc., that obviously has to be calibrated correctly. So I don't think the issue here is one of worrying about debt distress as such. I think it is important, as I said before, whether or not you are at risk of debt distress, whether or not you are at that level where you can say, according to sort of more standard parameters, you are slouching towards debt distress. I don't think that's a question. The question has to be, in the medium term, we need to put ourselves back in a sort of more normal indicators or more normal debt levels. And I think that is the important outcome. I think I explained it before. It's not to be done, say, tomorrow. Obviously, it is to be done in the medium term as the economy gains steam and begins to accelerate. So the point here is, of course, the indicators in terms of debt distress and others, or debt measures, debt metrics. It's not just debt to GDP, it's also things like debt to public debt to revenues, or for that matter, debt service and debt service to revenues and debt service to exports, because that's how you earn your foreign currency, etc., etc. And I think all those are part of how one defines whether an economy is moving towards debt distress, etc. But again, I want to stress the issue is to come back to more normal levels, sort of middle of the road, so that you have buffers on all directions. And I think that is the most important task in the, let's say, post-COVID period. So policymakers will continue to be busy, not just now during the COVID and indeed now transition to post-COVID, but even in the post-COVID period, they will be very busy as they frame the policies so as to go back to some of these things. By the way, in the case of Kenya, you also saw that there were some measures that are already being signaled in terms of the post-COVID period changes or return to more normal rates in terms of some of the taxes in 2021. Anything else, Wallace?
All right, that brings us neatly to the end of this morning/afternoon's press conference. This has been a press conference hosted by the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Dr. Patrick Njoroge, and it's one of the series of press conferences that happens after the Monetary Policy Committee meeting. In this case, it was held yesterday. We have heard different elements and dimensions of what was in that statement and more. And as we told you, all this will be made available to you on our different platforms, including our website and our social media platforms, as well as other material as and when it's appropriate. But for now, we leave it there. We shall see you after the next MPC. It's expected in November, but as the statement usually says, in case there's need to meet earlier, then you should be alerted on time, and that will happen. But for now, thank you very much, and good afternoon.